It is 2 hours before dawn, and a boy of 19 is standing knee-deep in blood. His hands are numb. Not from cold, though the wind cutting off the Tiber is brutal enough to crack skin, but from 3 hours of work that never stops. Around him, a dozen other men move in a rhythm so precise it looks choreographed. A hog is bled, a hog is gutted, a hog is quartered, the offal goes left, the meat goes right. Nobody speaks. Nobody needs to. This is not chaos. This is a machine built from human bodies. By sunrise, this single courtyard will have processed enough meat to feed a neighborhood of 10,000 people. By tomorrow, it will do it again, and the day after that. Every single day, for centuries, this cycle repeated itself in a city that had no refrigeration, no electricity, and no understanding of bacteria. And yet, somehow, ancient Rome, a city that would balloon to over 1 million residents, mostly avoided the kind of citywide famine and mass food poisoning that should have been inevitable. They did it through a system so elegant, so ruthlessly efficient, that modern food supply chain engineers still study it today. This is the system nobody shows you. Not the gladiators, not the senators, not the emperors. The actual machinery that kept the largest city on Earth from starving or rotting from the inside out. Here's the brutal truth they don't teach in school. Rome didn't solve the refrigeration problem. They made refrigeration unnecessary. They built a logistics network so fast, so brutally optimized for speed, that food was often dead, processed, and on a plate within 12 hours. No fridge required, because nothing sat still long enough to need one. We live in an age of refrigerated trucks, vacuum-sealed packaging, and global cold chains that span continents. And yet, in terms of raw speed from animal to table, some historians argue the Roman system, at its peak, was faster than ours. Today, we're going to take that system apart, piece by piece. The roads built for speed, not comfort, the legal codes that punished spoiled meat with public flogging, the guilds that controlled the flow of every pig, cow, and fish entering the city gates, and the human cost, measured in burned-out bodies and short, brutal lives that made it all possible. This is the story of how Rome fed 1 million mouths without a single refrigerator, and it starts not in the kitchen, but on the road. Let's start with the number that should terrify any city planner, ancient or modern: 1 million people. By the height of the empire, in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, Rome had grown into the largest urban center the world had ever seen. And no other city would reach that population again in Europe for over 1,000 years, not until London in the early 1800s, nearly 2 millennia later. That's worth sitting with. A city built with no internal combustion engines, no rail networks, no electricity, somehow sustained a population that London, with steam power and industrial infrastructure, didn't match again until the 19th century. And every single one of those 1 million people needed to eat, every day, without fail. Do the math on that for a second. If even half the population needed a pound of meat or fish per week, a conservative estimate for a culture that prized protein, that's hundreds of thousands of pounds of perishable flesh that had to move from farm or sea to table in a world where the fastest transportation was a horse, and the only preservation methods were salt, smoke, and speed. Here's the curiosity loop worth holding on to. How do you move a live, breathing 200-pound pig from a farm 50 miles outside the city into a butcher stall and onto a citizen's plate before it spoils, using nothing but roads, carts, and human muscle? The answer involves one of the most ruthlessly engineered transportation networks in human history. And it starts with something most people assume the Romans built for soldiers: the roads. The road network is often mythologized as an engineering marvel for moving legions. That's true, but it's only half the story. The same roads that let 50,000 soldiers march 40 miles in a single grueling day also functioned as the arteries of a perishable goods supply chain. A Roman road wasn't just packed dirt, it was a 4-layer engineering system. At the bottom, the statumen, large flat stones laid as a foundation. Above that, the rudis, crushed rock bound with lime mortar. Then the nucleus, a finer gravel and concrete mixture. And finally on top, the summum dorsum, interlocking polygonal paving stones, cambered slightly to drain rainwater off to the sides. This wasn't decoration, this was function. A flat, well-drained, all-weather surface meant a cart loaded with fresh fish or live poultry could move at a near-constant speed regardless of rain, mud, or snow. Compare that to most European roads, which remained unpaved dirt tracks well into the 18th century, turning to impassable mud the moment it rained. Here's your comparison stake. A fully loaded Roman supply cart on a well-maintained road like the Via Appia could average roughly 15 to 20 miles per day. That doesn't sound impressive until you realize that an unpaved medieval road in bad weather could reduce that same cart speed to less than 5 miles a day, assuming it didn't get stuck entirely. The Romans understood something that modern logistics companies spent billions rediscovering. Infrastructure speed is food safety. The faster you can move a perishable good, the less it has time to rot. But speed alone doesn't feed a million people. You need organization. And this is where Rome's bureaucratic obsession, something modern audiences often find tedious, becomes the actual hero of the story. At the center of Rome's food system sat an institution called the Annona, a state-run grain and food supply administration that functioned, in essence, as a government agency, dedicated entirely to making sure Rome didn't starve. The Annona wasn't just bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake. It was a response to a very real, very recent trauma. Rome had experienced devastating famines in its earlier history, moments where political instability or bad harvests led to genuine starvation in the streets. The Annona was the system's scar tissue, hardened into permanent infrastructure. The Annona oversaw the import of grain from Egypt, Sicily, and North Africa, provinces so critical to feeding Rome that losing control of them was considered an existential threat to the empire itself. But grain doesn't spoil the way meat does. Grain you can store for months. Meat is a different beast entirely, and meat is where the real logistical genius shows up. Every Roman city of significant size had a macellum, a covered, purpose-built meat and fish market, architecturally distinct from the open-air vegetable stalls, fora, found elsewhere in the city. The macellum wasn't just a building. It was a piece of food safety engineering disguised as architecture. Most macella were built with a circular or polygonal design, often with a central courtyard featuring a fountain or water feature, not for decoration, but for active cooling and washing. Stone counters, not wood, were standard, because stone could be scrubbed clean of blood and residue. Many macella featured sloped floors with drainage channels, literal built-in plumbing designed to whisk away blood, offal, and waste before it could attract flies or begin to rot in the Mediterranean heat. Here's a shock fact worth sitting with. Archaeologists excavating macella across the empire have found lead and stone weights stamped with official seals, government-mandated measurement standards used to prevent butchers from cheating customers on weight. Rome didn't just regulate what was sold, they regulated how it was weighed, with penalties for fraud that included fines, public shaming, and, in repeated cases, corporal punishment. Meat didn't move through Rome's markets unsupervised. It moved through a guild system, collegia, that functioned as a hybrid of trade union, regulatory body, and quality control enforcement. The Suari, the pork dealers' guild, controlled the supply of pigs, which were by far the dominant meat source in the Roman diet. Pork was prized because pigs could be raised efficiently, fed on forest mast and kitchen scraps, and, critically for our story, could be walked to market on their own 4 legs, arriving alive and only slaughtered hours before sale. This is the surprising solution we hinted at earlier. The secret to Rome's cold chain wasn't refrigeration. It was keeping the animal alive for as long as possible, transporting livestock on the hoof rather than meat on the cart, and only converting animal to food at the last possible moment, as close to the point of sale as logistics allowed. Pig drovers, men whose entire profession was walking herds of swine from rural farms to urban slaughterhouses, were a constant, unglamorous presence on roads leading into Rome. A drover might walk a herd of 50 or more pigs over several days, timing the journey so the animals arrived at the city's edge in the very early morning hours, ready for slaughter before the heat of the day could begin degrading the meat. This is precision logistics executed by men who likely couldn't read or write, using nothing but experience, timing, and an understanding of animal behavior passed down through informal apprenticeship. But feeding a city was only half the battle. Now picture a different scenario entirely, one with even less room for error. Imagine you're a legionary on campaign. You've just marched 20 miles under 60-plus pounds of armor and gear, the iconic lorica segmentata plates digging into your shoulders, a pilum spear weighing down one hand, your scutum shield slung across your back. Your feet are blistered inside hobnailed sandals. Your contubernium, your 8-man tent group, the basic social and logistical unit of Roman military life, is exhausted, hungry, and needs food now, not in 3 days when the next supply convoy might arrive. This is the military version of the exact same engineering problem Rome solved in its capital. How do you move perishable protein across vast distances fast enough that it doesn't spoil, in quantities large enough to feed tens of thousands of men? The Roman military's answer was almost identical in philosophy to the civilian system: live transport, local slaughter, and rapid distribution, combined with an obsessive reliance on preserved backup supplies for when fresh meat wasn't available. Every night on campaign, a Roman army constructed a fortified camp, castra, from scratch. This wasn't optional, and it wasn't casual. Roman military doctrine treated camp construction with the same seriousness as battle tactics, because an undefended army was a dead army. A surveying officer called a grammatic, using an instrument called a groma, essentially a wooden cross with plumb lines used to establish perfect right angles, would lay out the camp's grid before a single tent went up. Streets were standardized. The location of the command tent, the Principia, was fixed relative to the gates, and critically, livestock pens and butchery areas were positioned downwind and near the camp's drainage system, mirroring the same hygienic logic found in the Masella back in Rome. A Roman legion of roughly 5,000 men could construct a fully fortified, ditched and ramparted camp, complete with organized livestock and food processing areas, in as little as a few hours, using nothing but hand tools. Compare that to the time it takes a modern military unit to establish a forward operating base with heavy equipment, and the Roman achievement becomes almost absurd in its efficiency. Livestock, cattle, sheep, and pigs were often driven alongside the marching column or requisitioned from local territories as the army advanced, a practice the Romans called foraging, though it was frequently closer to organized confiscation. This meant the army, like the city, was eating animals that had been alive mere hours before consumption, minimizing spoilage risk without any preservation technology beyond salt. Roman military discipline around food safety was not gentle. Spoiled rations didn't just risk a bad meal, they risked an entire unit's combat effectiveness through dysentery, an illness that could cripple an army faster than any enemy sword. Roman commanders understood this, even without germ theory. They simply understood, through generations of brutal trial and error, that bad meat meant a sick army, and a sick army was a defeated army. Quartermasters who allowed spoiled provisions into the supply chain faced severe punishment. Flogging was common, and in cases judged severe enough to have endangered the unit, execution was not off the table. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was Rome's version of a food safety regulation, enforced with the only tools a pre-modern state had available: fear and consequence. Shock fact: Roman military medical texts, including the surviving work of writers like Celsus, described dysentery and food poisoning as among the most feared non-combat threats to an army, sometimes killing more soldiers on a campaign than enemy action ever did. The brutal punishments around food handling weren't excessive. They were, from Rome's perspective, proportional to a threat that could unravel an entire military campaign. Now, fresh meat on the hoof worked beautifully when the army was near friendly territory or the city was near its supply farms. But what happened when neither was true? What happened during a siege, a long sea voyage, or a winter campaign far from grazing land? This is where Rome's secondary system kicked in, and it's a system built on three pillars: salt, smoke, and acid. Salt wasn't just a seasoning in Rome. It was a strategic resource so critical that the word salary derives from salarium, the salt allowance historically associated with Roman soldiers' pay. Control of salt production, particularly from coastal salt pans and the salt roads, the via salaria literally translates to salt road, was treated as a matter of state importance. Salted and brined meat, particularly pork, preserved as an early ancestor of what would become ham and bacon, could last for months without spoiling. This salted reserve functioned as Rome's insurance policy. The fast, fresh system handled day-to-day demand, while massive stores of salted meat sat in warehouses as a buffer against famine, siege, or supply disruption. No discussion of Roman food technology is complete without garum, the fermented fish sauce that flavored nearly every dish in the Roman world, from the imperial palace to the poorest insula apartment. Garum was made by packing fish intestines and small whole fish into salt and allowing them to ferment under the sun for weeks or months, producing an intensely flavored liquid condiment. Here's the curiosity loop payoff. Garum wasn't just a flavor enhancer. It was, functionally, a fermentation-based preservation technology that allowed Rome to extract caloric and flavor value from fish that would otherwise spoil within hours of catching. Production facilities for garum, identifiable by their distinctive fermentation vats, have been excavated as far apart as Spain and the eastern Mediterranean, evidence of an industrial-scale operation exporting this product across the entire empire. This is Rome thinking several steps ahead of the spoilage problem. Rather than fighting decomposition entirely, they redirected it, using controlled fermentation to transform a perishable liability into a shelf-stable, tradable commodity. Let's return for a moment to that 19-year-old butcher standing in blood before dawn. His life was not glamorous. Butchery in Rome was often associated with lower status, despite, or perhaps because of, its essential nature. The work was physically brutal: repetitive heavy lifting, constant exposure to blood and waste, knife wounds that frequently went untreated or undertreated by modern standards. Average life expectancy in physically demanding trades like this was grim even by Roman standards, where overall life expectancy hovered in the mid-20s to 30s due to high infant mortality, skewing the averages downward. The pig drovers walking herds for days at a time slept rough, exposed to weather, often unpaid beyond subsistence, treated as a barely visible cog in a machine far larger than themselves. The quartermasters facing flogging for a single batch of spoiled grain, the legionaries who marched 40 miles only to dig a fortification by hand before they were allowed to eat or sleep. This system, the one we're calling with modern admiration a cold chain, was built on the backs of people whose names history never recorded. Slaves, freedmen, low-status laborers, and conscripted soldiers absorbed the physical cost of an empire's logistics so that senators, equestrians, and the urban poor alike could eat without dying of starvation or food poisoning. It's worth pausing here, because this is the part documentaries about Roman genius often skip. The system worked. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary feat of pre-industrial logistics, but it worked because Rome was willing to extract an enormous human cost from its most vulnerable people, and treat that cost as an acceptable price for civic stability. Every empire's infrastructure eventually outpaces its ability to maintain it. Rome's food logistics network was no exception. As the Western Roman Empire fractured in the 4th and 5th centuries, the centralized administrative apparatus that maintained roads, regulated guilds, and enforced quality standards in the Macella began to disintegrate. Without the Annona's organizing hand, without maintained roads, without the legal infrastructure to punish bad actors, the entire elegant system unwound. This is the comparison stake worth ending the technical section on. It would take Europe over 1,000 years to rebuild urban food logistics networks of comparable sophistication. Medieval cities, lacking Rome's paved road networks and centralized food administration, were dramatically more vulnerable to famine, food fraud, and localized outbreaks of foodborne illness. The Dark Ages weren't dark because people forgot to think. They were dark in part because the infrastructure that made large-scale urban life sustainable had been allowed to crumble. So what was the real secret of Rome's cold chain? It wasn't a single invention. It was a system. Roads engineered for relentless speed, markets engineered for hygiene, guilds enforcing quality through fear of punishment, and a military doctrine that treated food safety as seriously as battlefield tactics. It was salt, smoke, and fermentation deployed as a backup when speed alone wasn't enough. And underneath all of it, it was thousands of nameless workers, drovers, butchers, quartermasters, soldiers, grinding through brutal, repetitive labor every single day so that a city of 1 million people could wake up and eat breakfast without a second thought. Rome never invented refrigeration. They didn't need to. They built something arguably harder, a logistics network fast enough, disciplined enough, and ruthless enough in its enforcement that decay simply never had time to win. We live today surrounded by refrigerated trucks, vacuum-sealed packaging, and global cold chains that can move a strawberry from Chile to a supermarket shelf in days. And yet, for all our technology, we still lose nearly a third of the food produced globally to spoilage and waste every single year. Rome, with stone roads, human muscle, and salt, fed 1 million people every day for centuries. Maybe the lesson isn't that we need better refrigeration. Maybe it's that we need better systems. The Romans understood something we've started to forget. Technology doesn't solve logistics problems. Discipline does. If you found this as fascinating as I did, let me know in the comments which part of this system shocked you the most. And if you want to see how Rome solved its other impossible problem, clean water for 1 million people, make sure you're subscribed because that video is coming next.